you're working. Okay. All right, good afternoon. In 1965, Australia had not yet built a satellite. That year, a nerdy lot of students from this very university asked Project OSCAR, a California group that had built 4 amateur radio satellites, that if they could get an Australian one launched. OSCAR said maybe. It was enough. Over the next 2 years, Australis, as it was called, was designed and built, and in 1970 successfully launched into orbit through the efforts of a new group, AMSAT. Australis will keep circling for 450 years. This is the Australis story, told by 5 of their key members, and we're really excited to have them here today, sharing their expertise with the next generation of aeronautics enthusiasts.
Thank you, Owen Mace. I was one of those excited young men who were involved with the project. It was a year or 2 ago. I've just had my 70th birthday, so that gives you an idea of the age. We were undergraduates. Things were a little bit different then. So, it was very early days in satellites. But anyway, I'd like to ask Richard how on earth did this come about? Let's talk about how this satellite Australis came about.
Well, thanks, Owen. I'm sitting down because last week I got a bionic hip, which drags me kicking and screaming into the 21st century, and standing is a bit difficult, so excuse that. Well, I started at Melbourne Uni in 1962, and when I went into the Union building, they had all the clubs had their displays on, trying to get you to join the club, and I'd been a space nut, I think, as Owen had, and the other guys since pretty well since Sputnik had been launched in 1967, and there in the Union was a display from the Melbourne University Astronautical Society, and suddenly I realised that there were like-minded people, like-minded nuts, who were interested in space. So I joined that, and they were showing old films that NASA provided for them, and anyway, long story short, a group of us joined in or about that year or in the next year, and we got around to building a tracking antenna on the roof of what was then called the old physics building. If it's still there, it must be the very old physics building. And we built this antenna, a single helix, which enabled us to track American satellites, particularly the earliest weather satellites, and we downloaded pictures of Australia as the satellites came over. Then we built a quad helix, which was 4 times as big, and that enabled us to get even better pictures and track other satellites. So then, once we'd done that, somebody said in the group, well, what's next? And somebody else said, well, a satellite, and we all sat there and sort of stood there in stunned silence, probably over a beer at Norton's Royal Parkville Hotel. I reckon it was on the back of an envelope, in fact, that we sketched the thing out and said, well, yes, can we build a satellite? An American group called OSCAR had already had 4 amateur radio satellites built. They built them in San Francisco, had them launched by the Americans, Air Force. And so we wrote to them, Peter Hammer, who's in the audience here, who was the president of the University Amateur Radio Club, we wrote a joint letter to Project OSCAR and said, we've been following what you're doing great work. If we build a satellite and send it over, will you get it launched? And the reply came back very quickly in those days, for about 10 days, I think, by email, and they effectively said, you build a satellite and we'll try and get it launched. And that was all we needed. So we proceeded then to go and build a satellite. Owen?
Well, that's pretty much as it happened. One of these days we'll find out who actually made the suggestion, but I think that's going to be a secret held amongst us. I will mention that we've got just pictures running around in the background here, and they illustrate what was going on and so on. You'll also notice the antiquity of some of it, but because that's what it was. Anyway, Richard, in your words, what do you reckon we were trying to achieve out of this this satellite that OSCAR said they'd try to launch?
Well, I don't know that there was any grand plan. We just thought it seemed to be a logical extension from tracking satellites to building one, and there was some initial, I think, caution, particularly about the other people outside the group we spoke to, who said, no one's ever built a satellite in Australia, you don't know how to build a satellite, that's only for the big guys, how could you possibly build a satellite? And I think we just sort of got together and thought, well, let's give it a go. And there was never really any suggestion that we couldn't, amongst ourselves, that we couldn't do it. We were 21 or 22, and at that age, as some of the students here know, you can do anything. You know, you can live forever, and anything you want to do, you can go ahead and do. I don't know that there was any grand design about what we were trying to do. Clearly, we had to, in order to get the satellite launched, we had to fit into the parameters of not only the physical but the objective parameters of the OSCAR group. It had to be an amateur radio satellite. It had to transmit on the amateur radio frequencies, and amateur operators had to be able to track it. So that was the crux of it. It had to be a certain size. It had to fit in. It had to fit into a slot in the then Thor Agena rocket that was being launched from California into the American spy satellites. It was a secondary payload on American spy satellites. And so that was what we had to do. We had to be an amateur radio satellite, and it had to fit into a space in the actual in the rocket. There was some area there it would fit into, and that's the size it had to be, and that's why it's that box shape that it is. But otherwise, I think once we started, we just thought we're going to build a satellite. That was pretty well it.
Thank you, Richard. You were going to ask me why did we have press coverage and why, and the answer to that is we realised pretty early on that buying stuff to build this satellite was out of the question. It was, by the way, built for the grand sum of $1,400, although I dispute that. I think that was $400. Let's not argue about it. It wasn't much. But we knew we needed some fairly expensive stuff, so we deliberately undertook a media program, and we spent a lot of time on television. This has stopped. Oh no, there we go. And we featured regularly on the television news and in the newspapers, and that meant that we could just bob up to Fairchild Semiconductor, Henderson Springs, or whoever it might have been, saying, hey, we are who we are, we're the Australis mob. They'd recognise our faces and certainly the project, and we'd say, well, can you give us some space-qualified transistors, please? Yep, not a problem. So that was a real help to the project. So, yeah, go on. Yeah, quick.
Aaron mentioned Henderson Springs. We had to have fabricated two springs that would physically push the satellite away from the rocket. And we went down to the Henderson Federal Spring Works in Flemington. I think they're still there. I think it was Owen and I went into reception and said to the lady, we need to speak to somebody about building springs for a satellite. And she looked at us as if we were sort of gaga, and I think she said, are you kidding? Anyway, she went out and got one of the other people who came out, and they had exactly the same attitude. I went up to the managing director, who eventually came out and said, you want to do what? And we said, well, can you do it? If you can't do it, we'll go elsewhere. We were sort of, we were reasonably well known at that stage, but he hadn't heard about it, obviously. So, indeed, they built two springs, which worked reasonably well. The satellite had a bit of motion when it was pushed out from the rocket, but and did the springs go into orbit, or are they they're separately? So the springs are still in orbit. The springs are going to be there for another 450 years as well.
Is that right, Jan? That they?
No, it's much longer. The lifetime
Oh, sorry, details.
By the way, we lock wired the springs to the base.
Oh, okay.
So they're
So-
still part of the rocket. It's still.
Oh, okay. So we're in an orbit that's got a mere 100,000-year lifetime, so that probably, I'm thinking that'll outdo us.
I was hoping my grandchildren might be around for when it came down, but obviously not.
So I'm not, no. Anyway, the satellite was an amateur radio satellite, as Richard said, and therefore it transmitted on amateur radio frequencies. For those who understand this stuff, it was 2 metres and 10 metre bands. It had a little telemetry system, and Steve's going to talk about that in due course, identification. It had, and it was the first amateur satellite that had a command system on it that worked well, batteries, antennas, now there's a story, and a box to stick the thing in. And there have been pictures going past on the screen here, I hope, that you've seen what the box looked like, and it was a couple of shoe boxes in size, 23 kilograms as I recall, with mainly batteries. But anyway, one of the unique parts of it was again, first time ever, that we needed some way of stopping the thing spinning, because that's not a good if you're trying to listen to the satellite as it spins and the signals go in and out. So Steve, and I'm going to claim some responsibility also, I think, came up with a system which he's going to describe. Okay. Yeah. Oh, how do we bring up the... Away you go, Steve, just start talking. Can Steve's slides be put up, please? Who's the expert? Oh, here we go. Now this is a bit dramatic, isn't it? Here's a satellite.
Which one's with yours?
Okay.
Was yours there?
I can. Well, for a start, why did we include any attitude stabilisation system at all? Satellites with a serious purpose must have some kind of facility to maintain the orientation of antennas for communication, sensors, telescopes looking at stars and so on. We were doing nothing of the kind. Paradoxically, it was the simplicity of the system that demanded the attitude stabilisation. The telemetry system that Owen mentioned was designed for amateur radio operators. So it was indicating temperatures, battery voltage and current, was sending signals from the horizon sensors. So as the satellite was spinning around, it just indicated dark sky, bright earth and anything in between, just via, literally, a basic form of music. So for the amateur operators who couldn't be expected to have any specifically designed equipment to detect more complex encoded signals, it was just simple audible tones, and the musical pitch indicated the value of each item. So there was a 6.5 second burst for each value. There were 8 altogether stepping through. So with the variation, particularly in the horizon sensors, I have to apologise for this heap of junk. If you're here for the previous session, you know all about space junk. This demonstrates the purpose well enough with the thing spinning around randomly. So the signals from the horizon sensors were all over the place. These antennas, pretty crude, but still have directional characteristics. So if you happen to be underneath that antenna, you'd receive just about no signal from it. So with the signal strength going up and down, the frequency, musical pitch all over the place, and then stepping 6.5 second rate between each one, pretty useless. So that spinning had to be slowed down somehow. So there was a necessity, but on top of that, we were keen to experiment with a permanent magnet system to stabilise the satellite, because it seemed to us that compared to the other systems in use, this ought to be simpler and more effective. And also, in the spirit of the times and our youth, some of us were 18, so the old blokes were 22. There you go. We just wanted to give it a go. What did we do? Magnetic attitude stabilisation system, we called it. So it was a collection of lossy magnetic rods, hysteresis rods, to those of you who know about magnetic hysteresis. That's just a complicated way of saying that they were to reduce the satellite spin by wasting its energy through a magnetic process. But they didn't, in themselves, necessarily exert much force to line up with the Earth's magnetic field. In fact, they could, but not as much as a very strong bar magnet to follow the Earth's field. So looking at this picture, you just see the end of a magnet poking out there through in between all the electronics. Great big battery pack in the middle was that dominated the weight and the whole mechanical spin properties of the satellite. So it sounds very simple. It was. But as far as we knew, the method hadn't been used before, not exactly in this form. But for something so simple, why did even we agonise and argue about its operation? We probably thought that if it was likely to work as well as we were hoping, it would have been commonplace already. From the technical point of view, there is a potential conflict between the operation of the rods and the magnet, but we believe that was manageable. Very little written information was available, and even then, its relevance to a small satellite like this was in question. The lossy rods had been used in earlier and much more elaborate satellites. Even the first generation of military navigation satellites launched in 1960, but they didn't have the permanent magnet. Apart from our school physics, 2 astrophysics textbooks in the Baillieu Library were the total source of information. In case you don't believe I really mean that, in 1966 there was no internet, no means of sending instant messages to possibly helpful experts across the world, even if we'd known of any. We were on our own. One of those 2 books gave the magnet a brief mention, but in almost hypothetical terms. The other text complicated the idea by implying that reducing the spin energy, which is what the hysteresis rods would do, would be a little help without something else to remove the angular momentum. Now this is getting a little bit technical, but the methods that were suggested were much more complex than we could provide. Things like, called in the trade mass ejection, yo-yos, thrust rockets, or reaction wheels, sort of gyroscopic arrangements had to be driven. Far more complex. Now, I've been told to keep this simple, but have to explain what the angular momentum is all about. If you think you don't know about angular momentum or moments of inertia, if you've seen highboard divers and ballet dancers, gymnasts or spinning tops in action, then you've seen angular momentum at work. Fortunately, our satellite wasn't expected to have much of it, but still it had to be reduced. Well, again, for something so simple, was there any reason to expect it was going to be difficult? Think of the spinning ballet dancer on tiptoes. If the toes move to, or the feet move from tiptoe stance to flat on the ground, the spinning stops, of course. By friction or grip or traction, whichever way you want to think of it, most of the dancer's angular momentum is transferred to the earth. Of course, the earth doesn't notice a thing. We're being told that it's all different for satellites because there is no friction in space, so that sort of thing just can't happen. Well, of course, it's true that a satellite can't work the same way as feet on the ground, but is there any doubt that a similar momentum exchange can happen through the Earth's magnetic field? Magnetic compasses have been around for thousands of years. A magnetic compass needle wouldn't work without some angular momentum. A newer and more convincing example is the maglev train. It was patented in 1913, by the way. But clearly, momentum transfer is involved in those processes by magnetic means. Well, how did our system compare with the hysteresis rods used in the early navigation satellites in 1960? Well, the lossy rods they used were quite effective and stabilised the satellite after about a month. That was a more massive satellite, but we believed that with a powerful magnet as well, the result should be much better. Think of iron filings strewn around a magnet on a sheet of paper. Magnetic materials like that can also become magnetised, and you probably know, they line themselves up with the magnetic field. But we reckon that the permanent magnet would be far more effective. Now, we were expecting a battery life of only a matter of months, so we wanted to remove the spin as quickly as possible. So you'll notice that the magnet is along the maximum dimension of the satellite. All the other materials there were stainless steel and aluminium, so they weren't going to interfere with the magnet's effect. So if it all worked and the satellite long axis was lined up with the Earth's field, then if we're in orbit, magnet along this direction, following the Earth's field, calculations were that we could follow the Earth's magnetic field within, I think it was 18 degrees. I have the old handwritten calculations still. Still be a bit of rotation, we could afford that. Fairly slow rotation was tolerable. If you think of the Earth's field coming from a bar magnet, that bar magnet is relatively small compared to the diameter of the Earth. So if the magnet is horizontal over the Earth's surface at the equator, then as we head towards a pole, the satellite is dipping over compared to the Earth's surface. Even by the time we reach the latitude of Melbourne, we're pointing down at about 68 degrees to the vertical. Of course, has to reach vertical by the time it's crossing near the pole. The satellite orbit didn't go right over the pole, but pretty close. So it's, in terms of being able to follow the Earth's magnetic field at a speed, it's a pretty slow process. So that in itself wasn't a major problem. The permalloy wire had to be imported at some expense, and it needed heat treatment in a hydrogen atmosphere. That was done for us as a very valuable favour. We had to make up some apparatus to measure the loss in its hysteresis loop to work out the energy loss per revolution in order to calculate the contribution of that energy loss to the reduction of spin and so on. In contrast, the magnet was made for us in Noble Park by the dear old roller company. It cost us no more than driving out there to ask for the strongest one that would fit in the box. Well, how well did it work? As we'd expected, the satellite spin in the first few orbits made the telemetry decoding very difficult. But at about 15 seconds per revolution of the box, it was a good deal less than we'd feared it might have been. So the balance of the two springs was pretty good. But after only about 7 or 8 days, I think, the spin had slowed down to almost 20 minutes per rotation. And that was a pretty successful result. Very similar arrangements have been used on many small satellites since, and detail analyses are easy to find on the web. If you search for PMAS, PMAS, that's passive magnetic attitude stabilisation, there are plenty of them there. I doubt any would mention us, but we did it a long time ago. Whether it was just our ignorance at the time, consequent on lack of information of the state of the art then, or Antipodean sentimentality enriched over time now, we believe it was the first of its kind, and it worked.
Thanks, Steve. Now, Paul Dunn is going to take up the story.
Thanks, Owen. Well, my part in all of this was basically building up the box, the hardware associated with the thing, that the electronics was going to sit inside. This is a photo of a thing without its electronic bits and pieces. These are the connectors where the various transmitters, receivers and such like plugged in. That there is the end of the magnet that Stephen just spoke about. The other end's hidden under here somewhere or other. So that's the stabilisation. In the middle here we have the battery pack. In fact, I think we divided it into two, didn't we? So we could run off either just in case something went wrong with it. And this circuitry here is designed to distribute that so that at least one of them will keep working and delivering power to the electronics. That's what the outside looks like. The tubes here were where the springs sat, so that when the thing was released, it would spring out of the rocket and be free of it, leaving the springs behind, as Jan's pointed out. On the bottom here are two switches. They're compressed when it was in the vehicle, and once it's released, they open and establish power on the internal, so the thing turns itself on when it's released from the rocket. These little conical things with rounded tips are for locating the thing securely inside the vehicle before it's released. They locate it accurately. That hole there is for one of the antennas to stick out, since they went out 4 sides. That's just the inside with nothing in it. Again, showing these tubes that had the springs and the 2 switches. They are nylon sheets put on the bottom of it to provide a bit of thermal insulation. I seem to remember that's why we put them there. Again, there's the magnet sticking out the end for stabilisation. Just another general overall photo of the thing. Now, Owen, Richard and myself went over to the States to receive it when it was sent over, and that was us. I think that was Steve's idea, the little sign. So there's the satellite. And that's...
the Americans.
I think that's what it was for, yes. So this was the front yard of one of the OSCAR people who was looking after us, and the box arrived, and there it was, unpacked. Now, at that time, we used a lot of computing to do various things, predict satellite orbits and things for our tracking purposes, and even transmitting out orbital parameters for AO5, and this was the sort of computer we used at the time, which now will seem pretty old, but that was an IBM 7044 mainframe. That was the console of it, and this was, for its time, was a pretty good computer and reasonably powerful. I won't compare it with what we have today.
You'll have to explain what a mainframe is.
Well, you can still get them. Tape units were used in those days to store information and even run the operating system. Anyway, that's the sort of technology that was around at the time. That's it. Thank you, Owen.
Thanks, Paul. We do need to keep moving, but Richard insists that I tell a little story about an amusing event, and there were lots of them. There were lots of fun times, and it was a different time. I just emphasise this a little, that it was a different time. Anyway, we were doing the thermal testing, high temperature testing, to make sure that it continued to work, and Richard volunteered his oven in his home to do the testing. So thank you, Richard. Where he was staying, I mean. So thank you, Richard. We went around there and we did the test. But unfortunately, he didn't bother to say that he'd asked his girlfriend to come round and be the visiting cook. So she arrived with the chook all ready to go into the oven.
She denied she was a girlfriend at this stage.
I wasn't a girlfriend. All right, okay, I beg your pardon. She was a pre-girlfriend, I stand corrected. And so there was a few cross words, as I understand it. Fortunately, I wasn't there at the time. But however, all was made up, and dear Pauline is Richard's wife, and in a couple of years we'll celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary. But anyway, that was rather a fun time. So I don't think I should I? Yeah, just for 1 second, okay.
What happened was, it was a house in Carlton, living there with other students, and we had a system of visiting cooks, completely politically incorrect these days. And anyway, Pauline arrived, and I think I'd met her before, but she certainly wasn't a girlfriend. And she had a roast, in a roasting dish, and chook, I think it was. And she came into the kitchen, and she wanted to open the oven and put the chook in the oven. And she said, "Oh, thanks for turning the oven on." Then she said, "What's that thing in the oven?" I said, I puffed myself up to my full 6'1.5" and said, "Madam, that is not a thing. That is the Australis-OSCAR 5 high-frequency telemetry transmitter going through a high-temperature test. Go away." And she said, "Well, do you want your bloody dinner or not? Either it's the satellite or the chook." So I had to curtail, of course, the testing, and the chook went in. I think, in fact, that spacecraft, that transmitter didn't perform that well under high temperature. I think the testing wasn't quite completed.
All right, I stand corrected in some of the minor details. Thank you, Pauline. But anyway, as you can imagine, that was all very fine what we did, but there was a minor detail of which we knew nothing at that stage, of getting the damn thing onto a rocket and being launched. So that was up to the Amateur Radio Organisation, and Jan King in time became that person. And so Jan, would you like to tell us a little bit about how on earth you got Australis going on the satellite?
Okay, I'll try and do that. My name's Jan King, and I am almost an Australian. I call Australia my home. I live in Noosa in Queensland, and somebody has to live there. Will soon be, I think, an Australian citizen. But at the time, I lived in Washington, D.C., and all these events, you know, when Marconi sent the first message in Morris over the Atlantic, it was, "What hath God wrought?" And I think that messages may be appropriate here, because this really started something not only in Australia but in America too. So what I'd like to do is share with you, if I can figure out how to use the computer. I was expecting a mouse or something. Okay, I talk too much, it's a known fact. The first presentation will be kind of a silent presentation. I'll annotate it occasionally, and if you can put it in presentation mode. So this is not only about Australis-OSCAR, but what happened as a result of Australis-OSCAR, and it won't take very long. So is it? Yep, okay, so just read along and I'll annotate it occasionally. See, Republicans, not. No, the spacecraft was really not black. This stuff that's on there is called strip coat. The thermal guys have put on this beautiful coating for us, and we strip it off before launch. You'll see it in the next couple of slides later here. So I'm smiling here because they didn't, in those days they didn't have digital cameras, okay, so we're taking film, 35 millimeter film shots. They needed 64 for the documentation system, so it's crazy. Fortunately, this is the last time we ever launched in this position. This was a terrible place. It was about a half a meter from the second stage engine and about 1 centimeter from the first stage, second stage field joint where they separate. And this spacecraft was Australis-OSCAR 7. It was about 1/4 Australian by content, and it was the first time that Delta ever launched 3 satellites together, and that's part of our story that we'll be telling. So we then went on from that to build larger satellites, like this one. This has a 400 Newton bipropellant motor. We're the first amateur and the only one to date to ever launch a bipropellant motor. This thing had 1,500 meters of delta V, which is about the same delta V as a geostationary satellite applies at its apogee. We also, you'll see here that University of Surrey followed University of Melbourne by 11 years. You guys launched the first scientific educational satellite by 11 years compared to the next. And this was a satellite that we shouldn't have never built. It was too big. So if you're planning on growing like AMSAT did through its ages, stop short of this one. This one had 2 ergoles, fuel engineers that were professional and 1 amateur one. So don't ever say it can't be done. This spacecraft was completely loaded with about 350 kilograms of hypergolic fuel, and one of them was a radio amateur. And this spacecraft here is the forerunner of the CubeSat. Bob Twiggs was one of the 4 spacecraft that we launched on this launch, and he looked at these spacecraft. Now imagine 1/8 that size, and that's a 1U CubeSat. So Bob Twiggs had the idea. He said, those spacecraft are too big, I can do it in 1/8 the volume, and the rest is history. So we wanted to thank Australia all for what you put into this, because if that hadn't happened, AMSAT may not have happened, and CubeSat may have never happened because of all that. So just think of it in that order. But we want to point out that Australis-OSCAR 7, which was 1/4 Australian, was Peter Hammer built the command system. I forgot who built the RTTY telemetry, one of you guys probably. And that spacecraft right now has come back to life, battery failed short, then it's 20 years later, it was dead. 20 years later, it failed open again, and the spacecraft came back on the air. It's alive today. It's now the oldest operating spacecraft on Earth that's in orbit, that's in Earth orbit. So it's the oldest operating spacecraft in Earth orbit.
Excuse me a second.
And it was built in my basement.
Ask Peter to stand up.
Oh, Peter Hammer, yes. So Peter Hammer has the oldest operating command system in Earth orbit. So in the absence of a mouse, I need to turn on the second presentation. I apologize. I'm looking for a mouse. Oh, there's a mouse. Can I just open that? Oh, yeah, you're right. So we sort of talked about then just the evolution of things, but what you really need to understand is the politics of what happened, because it got really very interesting over on the other side when this thing actually arrived. So let's zoom way out and look at the big picture. The big picture is that we're looking at not just any old time in the history of spaceflight. We're looking at the time in spaceflight. We are smack dab in the center of the Apollo era. Not only that, I didn't know this till the other day when I analyzed it, but we were exactly between the launch of Apollo 12 and the launch of Apollo 13. Now, raise your hand if you don't know what Apollo 13 was. Okay, you have to go look on the net, and your homework assignment is to go figure out what it is, and then you go watch the movie about Apollo 13. Okay, so the people who made the decision, who said, yes, let's launch Australis-OSCAR 5, were none other than the administrator of NASA and the two highest level satellite associate administrators, one for science and one for applications. They said yes. Those guys they're not worrying about piggyback satellites. They're not worrying about weather satellites, which we flew with. They were spending 95% of their time trying to figure out the last details of what science was going to be put on the moon and how to save the lives of astronauts who are going to deploy those instruments on the moon. Okay, so we put that in perspective and we asked the question, those people who said yes, in the face of a lot of lower level managers saying, don't do this, they said yes in light of what was oncoming at them. And would they have made that same yes decision had, say, the ITOS spacecraft had a little problem with its camera, or the Delta with its solid rocket motors, and moved that launch, say, 90 days to the right? Would they have still said yes? Think about that. So to put the things in perspective here, at this point in the way things were in the world, Delta launch vehicle is becoming the workhorse for the launch vehicle industry. It was launching almost all the NASA spacecraft, a lot of other commercial satellites, and a few foreign satellites as well. The Delta program was at Goddard Space Flight Center. That's where I was working. The Delta was changing fast. Every few missions, they'd add something to the vehicle. They'd make it bigger. They'd make it more capable. Despite those changes, it was still a 92% reliable launch vehicle. And to set the perspective, Delta had launched all the prior TIROS weather satellites. And this is really a mission about weather satellites. Now, in the meantime, the U.S. weather program had been highly successful. It had been based at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, but it was moved to a new organization that was very quickly changed from ESA to NOAA. So it was a new agency that was responsible for meteorological satellites in order to become operational. The first satellite in the new series was going to be called TIROS-M, so retained the old name when it was on the ground, but it was going to be called the Improved TIROS Operational Satellite in Orbit, ITOS-1. And this spacecraft was a vastly improved technology platform that was capable of doing operational weather forecasting, which was a major step forward. To set the scene again, the players in the Australis-OSCAR game then at that point was Project Australis from the University of Melbourne, and the only organization I'm sure you would have interfaced with at the time would have been WIA, the Wireless Institute of Australia, who would have advised you to use amateur radio frequencies to do this. So the spacecraft was sent in 1967 to Project OSCAR. Now, Project OSCAR was an amateur radio group, not-for-profit also, and all those guys worked at Lockheed Space and Missile Systems Group, and they were quietly, because you didn't talk about these things in those days, building spy satellites. The system is called Corona. It's now an open system, and you can actually see Corona pictures, but at the time, highly classified. That was kind of a bit of a sphincter factor here for the continuing ongoing program, because while you're launching secondary spacecraft coming from other countries, you're putting them on the aft end of one of the most secure things that's happening in America. And so the OSCAR guys were having a little bit of trouble kind of sort of paving the way to do this. In the meantime, several of us formed AMSAT, the Radio Amateur Satellite Corporation, in Washington, D.C., but that did not happen until 1968, and by the time we could do anything, it was 1969. So this spacecraft is sort of sitting there in Australia, and it had been moved to a garage in Sunnyvale, California, where it sat, and then later we were able to convince others that it should be moved to Washington, D.C., where later on it was made a part of the Delta launch. Our interface was with the American Radio Relay League and the International Amateur Radio Union were involved in the radio licensing, but AMSAT formed a relationship, of course, with NASA, Goddard Space Flight Center, and NASA headquarters. I was working at the time at Goddard Space Flight Center for NASA as a sort of junior engineer. And then, of course, we have the whole NOAA stack of people that were involved. And the TIROS project, while it was done for NOAA, it was done at NASA at Goddard. So the project office was at Goddard, as was the Delta project office. So, again, trying to set the stage, what we forced upon the system was a spacecraft that wasn't expected, and what NASA and NOAA hadn't counted on was the sheer determination, the can-do attitude of the Delta people in the Delta Project Office, who became my very best friend, as you could well imagine. And they also didn't expect the amateur radio mafioso. AMSAT at the time was mostly 22-year-old testosterone combined with 50-year-old wisdom and perspective, in a very real sense, Washington, D.C. perspective, a group of guys who not only wanted to do it, they wanted to do it badly, and they knew how. So we had infiltrated, before we even started, every major organization we needed to. For example, the director of Goddard Space Flight Center, the highest level manager of that center, was a radio amateur. The guy who was running the NOAA program office for satellites, Jack Townsend, was a radio amateur. The guys we had to have circulate the paperwork within NASA headquarters were radio amateurs. The people we had to deal with at the Federal Communications Commission were like 5 times radio amateurs. We had them coming out of the woodwork at the FCC. The game that we were then playing that you have to sort of now appreciate is we had one group who put a lot of work into this from Australia, and with support through the Australian embassy and other forces in Washington, applying subtle pressure, saying, look, can you help these guys get this done? We had a young group of people who were both engineers and well-connected people in Washington who were radio amateurs that also wanted to get this done. We created this incredible organization. We had incredible goals, and we actually were trying, and we did achieve a lot of those goals. We took this spacecraft literally under our arm and set it on a desk in the Delta Project office, and before we knew it, we had a whole group of friends at the Delta Project who said, yep, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. Delta wants to be there for everyone. They want to do it, and they want it to be international. They improved the launch vehicle they had every time they had an opportunity, and sometimes they made those opportunities. International customers were important to them. Commercial customers were very important to them, and secondary payloads were important to them. On the other hand, NOAA had some issues too. They were very successful and had proved that now we can actually use these satellites in forecasting, major breakthrough. They wanted to be able to do this, and they didn't really want a lot of things to get in the way of this new technology they were about to demonstrate. Delta was trying to improve the launch vehicle more than they needed to get this mission done, and on top of that, they'd added this ham radio secondary payload to the aft end, and they were not entirely happy about that. So, again, trying to put things in perspective, these deltas you see here all happened. They all existed at one point in time. That great big thing exists today and is hardly ever used because it's too darn expensive. No surprises there. Putting it in perspective, we were working down that little bitty rocket down on the left-hand side, and all they wanted to do was go from 3 Castor 2 solids at the bottom to 6. That was the issue. That was the whole issue. So, the game is on. The satellite was sitting in Lance Jenner, the project manager at Oscar's garage. AMSAT did all the appropriate things to move forward and try and formally and informally request a launch. And so we pushed the button, we approached the administrator of NASA, we did all the right things we had to do there. At the same time, the Delta Project Office assisted us and agreed to build up the separation system that had to be built on the other side of the interface, the launch vehicle side of the interface, to separate the spacecraft, but we had to build the parts. That was partly a U.S. government rule. You couldn't build hardware for somebody who was volunteering things. You couldn't waste government taxpayers' money on these things, so it had to be built by us, so we did that. And very shortly after all this happened, we had our first meeting between the Delta Project Office, who was presenting us, Australis and AMSAT, to Goddard, and we had the meeting with the Tyros project manager at Goddard. And after listening to my technical presentation, Bill Jones, the project manager, says, I have 3 answers for you regarding this spacecraft. And he said, and you can pick whichever one of those answers you really like, that's fine with us. Well, fortunately, we didn't listen to him and pressed on. At NASA headquarters, Dick Daniels and Perry Klein, 2 of our senior managers, obtained approval signature from the Deputy Associate Administrator for Space Science. That was Dr. Dick Marston. The Delta Project Office, jumping the gun just a little bit, then went to Douglas Aircraft and said, okay guys, modify the vehicle, build the hardware for this. We think it's going to happen, and they did it on spec by a month or 2. AMSAT, with the help of Marston, then persuaded Thomas Payne, the administrator of NASA, to sign a letter authorizing us to go. The authorization, however, was contingent upon the approval of the NOAA project over there, and the launch was to be free to AMSAT. So this launch actually cost nothing for the public, if you will, for this event to happen. By the way, just for your general edification, this is going to be on camera, so I guess I have to say it's public. About $120,000 to $130,000 is roughly what that contract would have been worth from NASA to Douglas to put this thing on there. NOAA head of satellite programs, Jack Townsend, agrees. Of course, remember, another plant, he's AM. He agreed, but he did what I thought was very reasonable. He said it's contingent upon you guys doing a whole bunch of things. And he had a laundry list of things we had to do. And they were all very reasonable things, and we set about doing it. So what that really meant is by that time we could actually roll up our sleeves and actually do something. So we refurbished the satellite, replaced the battery, built that separation system that Delta asked us to, and environmentally tested the spacecraft, and that was one of the most brutal vibration tests I've ever seen because we were mounted, remember, only a half a meter from the second stage engine. So imagine the acoustic levels we would have seen at that position. It was pretty bad. Glad to say we never had to fly back there again. We completed the list of constraints. The ITOS project then reluctantly agreed to fly Australis-OSCAR, clearing the way for the launch. And this is the list of firsts that this system accomplished. Then the next relevant event, and this is sort of now, you would love to be in a position where this event occurs. There is a formal T-3 day review at the launch site. All participants are there. We're there taking part. And the ITOS project manager said yes, the Delta project manager said yes, and the center director of Goddard said yes, so that meant we're going. The launch of ITOS and Australis-OSCAR 5 was completely successful. The PMAS system worked great. In fact, the magnet captured in about 2 days, and the spacecraft sat there and just spun down exactly what it should have done. It did exactly that, and we have all that from the sun sensors, and it worked just great. So it completed its mission after 46 days. Now, there was more to this story behind the scenes than I knew. And how do I know that? Because of the party. The Delta guys worked hard, but they partied even harder. So they decided, as they often did, but not always did, to have a party in this occasion, because it was a bonding event between NOAA and NASA. NOAA is a new agency, brand new weather satellite system, modified Delta rocket, it all worked. And there was another little thing, that secondary satellite worked really, really well. So among those invited were the people you've already heard about. The NASA administrator did not attend, but the two deputy associate administrators, Lynn Jaffe and Dick Marston, did attend. The center director was there, and Dr. Jack Townsend, the associate administrator for meteorological satellite problems, the other big ham, was there, and as well as all of the Delta dignitaries that were involved. Also invited were the AMSAT team, and myself and Dr. Perry Klein attended, along with Dick Daniels, who worked the paperwork all the way through headquarters, and another gentleman named Harry Helfrich was a very helpful guy. So, John Tomasello, who was the second tier, he was our mission integration manager. He worked directly with me to do all the hardware and make sure everything got integrated in the proper order on the vehicle. He disappeared for a few days, and Bob Goss, the head of mission integration, had sent him over to the machine shop where he built about 24 of these, which is a little model of Oscar there, and a little inscription, and of course, notice the shape, it's a delta. So they got all the politically right stuff in there. And this is what the base looks like. You can come up and have a look at this after. It says, Delta 76, the launch of Oscar A and Tyros M. I'm really very sorry that I don't have a picture of Bob Goss, because he's the hero of our story, the head of mission integration. He's the one who took all the political headwind here and who pushed forward. But I did have a picture of John Tomasello. John became a friend of mine after that, and we were best friends until he died in about 1993. Very big. If it hadn't been for this gentleman, you guys probably wouldn't have gotten up there. Okay, so Bob Goss never wanted to miss the opportunity for social satire. And the way I know that this was discussed at higher levels within NASA is because of the generation of this song. Bob didn't pull out the four flushers unless something important had happened. And I never, ever thought I would have a song sung about something that I did. So this was a group of people who sang in 5-part harmony called the Four Flushers. So you have a quintet called the Four Flushers. Don't ask me. The toilet language is something, see me offline. It was a big thing for the Delta thing. There's a lot of stories there. This song wasn't up to Banjo Patterson standards. What I would say is it nonetheless told beautifully the story of what had happened really during that year when Tyros was approached by the upstart Australis. And I think you've all heard the song before. So it was to the tune of A Bicycle Built for Two. So it goes, Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer due. I'm half crazy, all for the love of you. It won't be a stylish marriage, I can't afford a carriage, but you'll look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle built for two. Now it turns out that Daisy was a bit Edwardian. It turns out she was actually, the real Daisy was a distant relative of Edward VII of England. So if her response sounds a little bit Edwardian, I think we can forgive her for that. Henry, Henry, this is my answer true. I'm not crazy over the likes of you. If you can't afford a carriage, forget about the marriage. I won't be jammed, I won't be crammed on a bicycle built for two. Now, Mr. Goss commissioned the Four Flushers to sing the song on this evening, and this is the song that he proposed. The first verse is from the Tyros project manager singing to me, who was, nobody in the audience could have been more surprised than that. So he's singing to the project manager, Oscar. Oscar, Oscar, give me your answer due. I'm unwilling to share my ride with you. You'll probably block my vision or cause a space collision. So I'll be damned if I'll be crammed on a vehicle built for two. Next verse. Now the Oscar project manager sings back to the Tyros project manager. Tyros, Tyros, here's my reply to you. I'm approved by NASA HQ, so don't be unkind or bossy with this hitchhiking Aussie, and I'll look neat in the rumble seat of a vehicle built for two. Third verse, Tyros, very frustrated, now turns to the Delta project and says, my recourse, what am I going to do? Delta, Delta, here's all I have to say. If he bumps me, there will be hell to pay. 6 solids we could not prevent. This hand adds to our torment. We never thought that we'd get caught on a vehicle built for two. Now the punchline. Delta responds to the Tyros program. Tyros, Tyros, not a thing can go wrong. Be a hero, let Oscar tag along, and be a content precursor. It could have been much worser. We could, you see, have carried 3 on this vehicle built for 2. And as though this was foretelling the future, 4 years later, 28 Delta rockets later, 7 ITOS spacecraft later, and 2 Oscar satellites later, we have ITOS 7, Intelsat, a Spanish spacecraft taking this number 2 position, and the number 3 position is taken by AMSAT Oscar 7, now the longest living spacecraft in orbit, period. And the University of Melbourne was part of that. A program note here, about this time, which was, remember, 4 years later, there was a new ITOS project manager. He'd been the deputy project manager technical, and he'd been my worst nightmare, my nemesis. He was the guy who was overlooking our spacecraft. Whenever it came to the launch site, he'd look in the box, he'd He'd look at it, he'd make sure that nothing was going to fail. He'd go talk to everybody in the background, he'd come back and ask questions. He had been a nightmare for me. But he was now the project manager for, Bill Jones had gone away, another project manager, then Jerry Burdett took over that management. He came up to me at this point, we're closing the fairing. Remember, this is a sacred moment for any aerospace engineer. Your spacecraft disappears when that second fairing half goes on. You never will ever see it again. You've been living with this box for 5 years, and all of a sudden it disappears to your face. So I'm here having this religious moment, and along comes Jerry Burdett, and he puts his arm on my shoulder and he says, "King, that's a mighty nice spacecraft you've got there. I hope it works well." And he meant it. 2 months later, after the successful launch, Jerry became a radio amateur and he joined AMSAT. He became an AMSAT member. True story. So I guess that really does say, well, if you can't beat them, join them. And speaking of joining, at this very point also, I joined the Delta Project team and went to work for Bob Goss because anybody who could do this kind of stuff, it was so cool, I just had to be a part of it. So for 4 years, I roamed the world integrating large spacecraft and small spacecraft to the Delta launch vehicle, which was growing in performance every day. I have a closing statement. To make. So let's now try and address the moment. So our hero Bob Goss of Delta delivered his message. The NASA luminaries thought they were coming to a party to hear about weather satellites. But what they got from the Delta Project in good humor was a message. We got your baby up there and put it where you wanted it. We proved to the world that our modified rocket still works. And wait, there will be more. We did our bit to help start the next generation of aerospace engineers who will replace us all. But we can do even more, and we can do even better. Trust us. And, what are we waiting for? And here's the message from Bob Goss and the Delta team to Australia, coming at you from 45 years in the past. Will you, once again, try to create a space program, as you are? You can do it. You can do it even better than you think you can. Trust yourselves. No, really trust yourselves. You must develop the next generation of Australian aerospace engineers, and this time, those should be the engineers that really build satellites. And what are you waiting for? This time, Australia, you have a heavy coin in your pocket. Take it out. It's been there far too long. On one side of this coin, it says risk, but on the other side, it says opportunity. This time, Australia, put that coin on the table, heads up. Leave it there. And if you ever forget which side of that coin is heads, think about the NASA luminaries who said yes to little Australis in the face of oncoming Apollo 13. Yes, chance and luck play a role in this, but then think about the outcome of Apollo 13. It wasn't just a movie. Think about the Delta team who said yes in the face of no, hell no, and never. And think about the UniMelbourne students and the AMSAT engineer that stand before you. We said, let's do it. Australia, take a chance. Thank you.
We are just about out of time, but I just have to thank Jan. Remember, he was a junior engineer, and I reckon he was probably given the job because they knew that he couldn't do it, that he would fail. But he did, and thank you very much indeed for that. So, are there any questions? When do we have to be out of here?
We have a bit of time, so if you want to take some questions, that's more than okay.
It's okay?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Come on then, questions. Questions.
And if you just
Richard's
wanna-
going to stir... yes,
You
sir.
just want to put your hand up and I'll just bring the microphone over to you.
Shout it out.
Oh, we need it on the audio, so sorry.
So what material was the magnet made from? Was it a, one of these neodymium magnets, or was it an iron-based magnet?
Just Alnico. Yeah, aluminium, nickel, cobalt.
Thank you.
Made by Roller, which is probably a name that you don't remember or don't know, but they made loudspeakers.
Yeah, magnetic tapes.
Magnetic tape, yeah, all of that sort of magnetic experts. Come on, next. Next. Oh,
So when you started working on this, the RESAT-1 satellite was, about to start being designed and manufactured as well. And I remember some of you telling me about some rivalry that may have emerged between the official government-mandated satellite and Australis-OSCAR 5. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the things that happened that made you think that, the government might have been keeping rather a closer eye on what you were doing than you would expect for a bunch of students and enthusiasts and amateurs.
well, of course, there are these bunch of, for God's sake, undergraduate students, and graduate students. What would they know? And I'm talking about people in the weapons research establishment in Salisbury, which you probably don't know is north of a little Victorian regional country town called Adelaide, where I live, in fact. And anyway, they were established after the war for weapons testing at Woomera and so on, weapons research establishment. And they must have thought, for God's sake, this bunch of wacky students at, where is it? Melbourne Uni, for goodness sake. We better do something about it. This is a story for conspiracy theorists amongst us, by the way. And so we were sitting up in our little garret in the physics building. One day, telephone goes off. We apparently had a telephone. Amazing stuff. And so I picked it up, and very embarrassed lady on the other side of the other end of the telephone said, "I'm from the establishment, and I'd like to ask you questions about your satellite." Fine, okay. So, told her about it, and I asked questions and told her what she wanted to know. The very next day, RESAT was announced. Now, RESAT was a satellite built by Weapons Research Establishment and launched from Woomera some time later, before, in fact, Australis was launched.
While you guys were kind of sitting in Jenna's garage.
That's right, while we were sitting in Lance Jenner's garage, that's right. There's a good conspiracy story for you, and I guarantee that it's true, maybe. That was the story.
Still the first spacecraft built.
Australis was still the first spacecraft built in this country, yes, quite so. Yeah, Richard's got a question.
People often ask about those antennas that, the aerials that are on Steve's model, about what they were made of. The answer is very simple.
And if you look closely at the pictures, you can still see the numbers on the paper.
Jan's right, exactly. We got them from the Stanley people who made tape measures, and they said to us, "We're sorry, but because of the manufacturing process, we have to leave the inches and feet as they then were on the tape." So they were they were wrapped around the satellite, as you saw on the pictures, and when it was released into orbit, they just sprung out by themselves and had their own, they supported themselves, and they worked a treat.
They did.
And we used them for 10 missions after that.
Used for 10 missions after that, so there you go. Nice, simple Aussie solution, isn't it? Questions? Come on, guys and girls. Yes. Oops. Yeah, don't hold it. That's it, exactly.
What does OSCAR stand for?
What does OSCAR stand for?
Orbiting Satellite Carrying Amateur Radio.
Orbiting Satellite Carrying Amateur Radio. Good question. Chuck us out when we need to go.
This may have to be the last question.
Last question, okay.
Thank you very much. You are talking about a space language, which is not easily understood by me. I want to find out from you your successful launch. What does it mean to Australia, and what is meant for yourselves?
Oh, okay. It was launched from the United States, Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. And that's a terrific question, by the way, the second bit of it. What did it mean? Well, it meant different things to each person. There are so many stories. How many hours have we got here to finish this off with stories and what it meant to us?
Probably not hours.
And I could, really could go on and on. I think for me, personally, it was the fun and the satisfaction of doing this thing, which we didn't think was particularly amazing at the time. Let's do this fun thing, let's get on with it. One thing I will say is we had an extraordinary number of friends. Jan, that we didn't know, of course, at that stage, was one, but also the NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Senior Scientific Representative in Australia, Mr. Wilson Hunter, was an extraordinary friend and mentor for us, and I suspect that he pushed a lot more than we will ever know. I think that has to be the end of it, but we'll certainly be around for anyone who wants to press us on any questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing such amazing stories and your expertise and your experiences. And it's certainly very inspirational to us here at the Melbourne Space Program, and I'm sure many other people in this room. So please, everyone, join me in thanking them once again.
All right. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Steve.